Hello and good day, everybody. Welcome to your Ruby Live event. My name is Eric Wynkoop, and I'm the Director of Culinary Instruction here at Ruby. And I'm also one of your chef instructors in the courses, along with the rest of my instructional team. And today is my office hours, and I want to thank you very much for joining me today. This is your chance to ask really anything you want about food and cooking. And as always, I ask you to kind of stay within that domain rather than straying out into too far into nutrition or medicine, for example, as it relates to food, because that's out of bounds. But as far as cooking and food goes, I'll do my best to answer your questions today. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact me at support@ruby.com. And your question will make its way to me. All right. And as we get started today, I'd like to mention just a couple of usual housekeeping items. As you look at your screen on the right side, you'll see in the upper corner a dialog box. And it says add question here. And so if you have a question or a comment, feel free to type that in, and that'll make its way into the queue that you see on the right side of your page. There are a handful of questions already populated. And as you take a look at those questions, you'll note in the upper right-hand corner of each of those question boxes a heart-shaped icon. If you would like to prioritize that particular question, click on that heart, and it'll push it up to the top of the list or toward the top of the list, and I'll answer it sooner than later. But as always, I will respond to all of the questions that you send in. Okay, and without further delay, let me go ahead and get started with today's questions. And it looks like the first one is from Laura. Hello. I have a set of stainless steel pans, but food always seems to stick when I saute, especially when I'm not using oil. Do you have any tips to prevent sticking? This is a perennial question, and let me provide some context that will, I think, help us down this path as we interact with food cooked with no oil in a variety of different pans. But number one is to keep in mind that the idea of no oil cooking is relatively new. I mean, I don't know when it started, but really within the context of cooking, certainly within my lifetime, it's a relatively new approach when we're talking about dry heat cooking methods, right? Moist heat cooking methods, that's not an issue, right? But when it comes to trying to saute, that classic dry heat cooking method, the idea of using no oil makes it difficult, right, from step number one. And so that's why classically in the saute cooking method, oil is part and parcel of that experience. But as we try out no oil cooking, then, we have a couple of solutions that work some of the time. And then we also need to be ready to make some compromises. Okay. And, do keep in mind that generally speaking, a cooler pan tends to stick more than a hotter pan. And this is why in our mercury ball test lesson video for heating your stainless steel saute pan, we do bring that up to a pretty high temperature. And there's a little more explanation provided in that lesson video. And feel free to take a look at that at your leisure. But I'll start off by saying that if we're cooking animal meats, animal proteins, then that method is really effective. You bring the temperature up very high. There are going to be some fats that come out of the meat, and then with a little bit of time, the meat starts to release itself from the pan. And so we can get by without the addition of oil. As we talk about plant-based foods, then our subset of foods that are easier to saute or to brown in this context becomes a little bit smaller. And you'll need to do some playing around a little bit here. But starchy foods, for example, tend to be difficult, right? So potatoes, can be very difficult. But the technique that we use to, as a, I guess that characterizes no oil sauteing in a stainless steel pan with plant-based foods is to lower your pan heat just a little bit from that initial mercury ball testing temperature. In fact, I'll come back and talk more about this in a moment to put that in context, but back to the main conversation here. We want to drop the heat a little bit so that we don't burn items that are particularly delicate, like garlic, right, or onions and shallots, for example. But otherwise, once some browning is developed, we add liquid to the pan, and that liquid is typically stock. We try to use a flavorful liquid where possible, which means that certainly wine, can be used to deglaze the pan as well. In fact, many of our Ruby recipes do call for wine to be used when deglazing the pan. But keep in mind, especially if you're avoiding alcohol, that stock, your choice, any kind of a stock can be used to deglaze the pan. What that does is it cools the pan temperature, and so it mitigates burning, and also will sort of disrupt the browning process. That moisture will also release the product from the pan. There's going to be a little bit of sticking that starts to occur typically, and we should be vigilant, standing nearby with a utensil in our hand and moving the product in the pan for even coloration as needed. And, as we see that color darkening, significantly, then it's time to deglaze, to add that flavorful liquid, or it could be water, right? In the absence of stock or wine or something else, feel free to use some water. And move that product around, lifting it off of the surface of the pan with your chosen utensil, and then we allow that liquid to evaporate, and we can continue with the browning, developing more browning, or we can continue with the addition of the next ingredients in that recipe. Okay, and so that's a general approach, that general technique that we use in the no oil saute context. Okay, let me jump back to the mercury ball test, right, around heating your saute pan, and put that into some context. So the idea here is for you to get to know your equipment. Right, so as you use this technique to heat your stainless steel pan, right, you'll take the time that's needed, and do it repetitively until you get a feel for the process and the feel of the heat of the pan. And I can remember a number of years ago when I was first introduced to this technique through Ruby, I spent an hour probably doing this a few times until I understood the process. And so, I would certainly expect, any of our students to go through the same sort of a learning process, the ramp up process around this experience. And so that, again, the idea is that you do this a few times so that you can gauge the heat of the pan by feeling the radiant heat on your face, on your hands, on your arms as you're cooking. And so that eventually you don't need to do the mercury ball test anymore. Okay. Some students will ask me from time to time, So just tell me the temperature of the pan. I have an infrared thermometer. How hot should the pan be? And I don't know. I mean, I have an infrared thermometer too, but honestly, I've never used it for this activity. I just feel the activity, the heat, and get to know the cooking process through that experience. And that's what I recommend for all of you. Okay. Do keep in mind, right, that temperature of your pan at that point is going to be really hot. So I don't recommend adding oil because there's a chance that your pan temperature may have already exceeded the flash point of the oil that you're using. And in other words, I have heard of experiences where a cook has added oil to their pan and it's burst into flames. And so to avoid that, understand that very high temperature is not suited for many oils. Certainly some can be used, but I don't know which ones those are offhand. Okay. So beware, I guess, is the take home here. The other part of my discussion here on this excellent topic, and I appreciate you introducing this, Laura, is to consider a nonstick pan. And there are many types of nonstick pans in terms of the technology that's used, the coating, and the more specific design around the pan. And, I've used nonstick pans off and on over many, many years, but I'm not necessarily up to speed on every option out there today. So I recommend just giving it a try. I will also add, my opinion here, and that is that I don't recommend spending a lot of money on, first of all, a set. I don't recommend buying a set of nonstick pans. And then number two, don't spend a lot of money on a nonstick pan because over time they accumulate scratches, micro scratches, and their nonstick quality will decline over time. So in my opinion, a nonstick pan is a disposable item. And I replace mine as needed, whatever frequency that is, every couple of years or something like that. And so, you will get to a point where it's not so nonstick anymore. So be aware of that. But a nonstick pan, nonetheless, can help your no oil saute with a lot of items. Some things like eggs are very finicky, and I'm not a fan of trying to cook eggs without oil. If that's what you want to try to do, give it a try and see if you can find a place of success. But otherwise, I do use a touch of oil for some items. And so that's where the compromise comes into play, right? So if you're bumping up against an item that is particularly finicky, then you might consider just the addition of a little bit of oil to make your life a lot easier and to make your cooking successful. Okay, and so that's my short answer for this question, and I hope that's helpful. Thank you. All right, next up, hello, Marina. When bringing home greens such as kale, Swiss chard, etc., can they be treated like lettuce? That is to say, separated, washed, and stored in containers, or is there a better way for such vegetables? I would say that your suggestion is spot on. Especially when we're talking about these leafy greens that have sturdier leaves, they can withstand the washing and the separation from the stem or the stalk, and then the storage pretty well. Other more delicate leaves probably have a shorter shelf life and therefore should be used quicker, which means we might want to purchase in smaller quantities or keep the head intact where there's just a little more moisture to sustain the individual leaves, and you can just break them off as needed. But as far as I think the main point of your question, what you suggested is perfect. A great way to handle those sturdier, hardier leafy greens. Thank you. Hello, Robert. One lesson in the Forks Over Knives course mentioned, it's better to purchase wines from a wine store in place of, say, Marsala cooking wine in a grocery store. When deglazing onions, for example, what type of wine would you suggest? Yes, so a two-part question here. This is a fun question. And, regarding where to buy wine, I think it really depends on, what the grocery store options look like in your neighborhood, in your neck of the woods. In other words, more and more these days, the mainstream grocery stores have a pretty nice wine section. And, often they don't, they're not at that level of diversity that you would find in a dedicated wine shop, especially wine shop. But you're going to find some good quality wines, probably a reasonable selection, meaning a selection of wines from a given region, as well as a selection of wines representing a particular grape, as well as a selection of wines representing a particular style of wine, such as a fortified wine in the Marsala category. Okay. Again, if you're a little more, I'll say, picky about your wines, or you want to try out some less common non-stream labels or varieties, then you might visit a wine specialty store. Okay. But otherwise, I think most of us, most of the time, can be very successful at our local grocery store, again, provided, it's probably one of the bigger ones that, has a more robust wine offering today than they did, say, 8 or 10 years ago. Okay. And, on to the second part of your question, Robert, regarding deglazing onions, for example. Generally speaking, if it's a lighter colored item or a lighter colored finished dish, then I'm going to reach for a white wine. And, common white wines include Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc for deglazing, for cooking. But certainly you can use other white wines according to your preference. Now, the wines that I just mentioned and the wines that are generally suggested, especially for savory cooking, will be dry wines. And so a dry wine means non-sweet. So in other words, during the fermentation process, all of the sugars were consumed and you're left with a wine that is dry, okay? Versus a sweet wine or a different style at the sweet end of the spectrum of wines. And we do use sweet wines in dessert preparations. So do keep that in mind, okay, when a recipe calls for a particular wine. And then on the other hand, if the item to be deglazed or the finished product is darker in color, maybe a dark stew or a dark soup, for example, you can feel free to use a darker wine, meaning a red wine. And, in that case, again, there are many options out there, but some of the more common or mainstream wines available in the markets include Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot and, Pinot Noir as some common choices. Okay, but there are many, many more. And if you have any favorites that you like to drink, then those often are a good choice for cooking as well. Okay. Generally speaking, as we go to a grocery store or sometimes even a dedicated wine store, you'll see a cooking wine, what's labeled and marketed as a cooking wine. Read the ingredient label. Very often they have the addition of salt. And those aren't my favorites to use for cooking, only because I like to drink the wine that I'm cooking with as well, and I don't like salty wine. So keep that in mind. And then lastly, there is such thing as sweet red wines. We don't see them as often, but if you're making darker sauces for sweet application, you might seek those out to sort of complete your project. Okay. Yeah, I hope that answers all of the points that you might have been thinking with your questions here. Thank you. And Billy, good day. Happy holidays to you. And your question is, I found a beautiful Brussels sprout stalk, and I plan on roasting it whole. How would you approach this task? This sounds very interesting. And I got to say that I've never roasted a whole Brussels sprout stalk, although it has crossed my mind. I think they're beautiful, and it would make an intriguing focal point on the table. The way I would approach this is much like the way that our lessons introduce you to roasting Brussels sprouts, individually, and that is in an oven at high temp. And you might consider something in the range of 425 or 450 degrees to get some nice browning. Browning contributes not only to visual appeal, but also flavor development. So it can add some nice, deep, sometimes smoky notes to the finished product. I would consider rotating the stalk of Brussels sprouts while you have it probably on a sheet pan. And if it's a sheet pan you're working with, consider a silicone baking mat because they become very hot in the oven, and the silicone mat itself will promote browning at those points of contact. Okay, and then if you rotate that to try to maximize contact and therefore color development, you'll get some more interesting visual appeal on that finished product. And then season it, however you'd like, and then look forward to an interesting presentation and some nice conversation at the table. Becomes a very interactive piece, I'm sure. Enjoy. Thank you. All right, and got another note from Robert here. Note of thanks for all the pearls of cooking wisdom you continue to provide on this format. Just excellent stuff. Enjoy your holiday. Thanks so much, Robert. I appreciate your participation here, not just today, but in past events as well. And as you continue to have questions, this is a beautiful interactive format with our instructors and staff here at Ruby, but also feel free to reach out at any time via support@ruby.com with any questions or comments. Happy holidays. All right, next up, I would like to get a better knowledge of the composition of a balanced meal, especially regarding proteins. I would like also to be able to prepare meals that non-vegan people's palates would appreciate too. All right, well, this is a big question, and let me take this on in little bite-sized chunks, right? Pun intended. The first disclaimer that I'll throw out is that part of this question sounds like that it might be suitable for a dietitian. Okay, if you're really talking about nutrition as it relates to your meal planning. And so I'll leave some of those very specific and nuanced nutrition sort of talking points to somebody who is more grounded in that space. But generally speaking, if we're talking about the plant-based foods, I understand that a lot of people, especially in the United States, where protein consumption is really strongly emphasized, there's concern about not getting enough protein when shifting to a plant-based diet. And, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that when one enjoys a broad and varied diet, then for most people, most of the time, nutrition is not a concern. In other words, you're going to get the adequate vitamins and minerals and amino acids for protein building, etc., to keep your body healthy. Certainly, if a person has a specific concern that they're addressing, then they're probably aware of that, and they should probably reach out to a specialist in this area, like a dietitian. Okay. But all of the plant foods that we eat contain amino acids. Amino acids, again, are the building blocks for protein. Our bodies have intelligence. And as we eat these foods, our bodies will put these puzzle pieces together to create the protein that it needs. And of course, that is going to be based upon a varied diet, a balanced diet, and ideally one that is based on whole foods as well. So rather than processed foods, all right? And part of this bigger picture is also the fiber that is so important for us. And fiber is one of my favorite F words, and you'll hear me talk about that from time to time here. And this is where the whole foods come in to keep things clean on the inside, right? Fiber is nature's broom, and it's so important in many, many ways to our internal health, okay? And so that's part one of your question. So part two is preparing meals that non-vegan folks would also appreciate. And so, here I'm going to take a similar approach, and that is one of low anxiety, low stress. And for me anyway, when I cook, I don't worry about who's at the table. I focus on preparing foods that taste good. And if the food tastes good, it's going to be considered tasting good across the board for whoever's at the table, whether they're a carnivore or a plant-based person or somebody else. And so, I'm going to go back to those foundational points that we talk about in the Ruby courses, and that is to focus on developing your understanding and your skills around cooking methods, and also the ancillary techniques that support various preparations, okay? And rather than being focused on recipes, right? To be recipe driven really means that you're sort of pigeonholing yourself and limiting yourself to the directions of that particular recipe. Whereas if we take an open-ended approach to understanding cooking methods and food handling more generally, then we can apply that understanding and that skill to any recipe we encounter. And we are in control at that point. And as you move down this path, right, part of our goal is to start to develop our palate around flavors and balancing tastes and understanding how we do that through cooking methods as well as ingredient choice, okay? And the result is beautiful food. And everyone at the table at that point will enjoy your cooking. Again, regardless of what their personal eating style might be. Okay, so I hope that that general approach, that response, is helpful in instilling confidence in you. Okay, it's all up to you, and I know that you can do it because I've seen so many of our Ruby students get there. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Kathy. Good day. What are your thoughts on putting fresh broccoli and asparagus stalks, okay, in water to keep them fresh? Now, approximately how long can they be stored in the water? Well, good question. I do this with some items from time to time, and I think it's a good idea. It keeps them from dehydrating, which is a big problem in most storage environments, whether it's at room temperature in your kitchen or it is in the refrigerator, which is fundamentally a drying environment. So storing them in the stalks in water, probably just a little bit of water is going to be fine. After we slice off a thin slice to expose the cells, a fresh layer of material, put it in a little bit of water, and then give it a try. See how you like that. There is certainly a good opportunity that the product, as it gives off moisture through its leaves, it'll draw in moisture through the stalk, so that moisture is replenished, right? So that's the the idea behind this process. Okay. How long can it be stored in the water? It all depends, right? Depends on the product, depends on the temperature of the refrigerator, or not in the refrigerator, right? What the ambient temperature is. So you need to keep an eye on that. Things are still aging in that environment, and foods are maturing. They're changing, by the hour, by the day. And so we still need to get to it and use it pretty quickly. Another thing to keep an eye on is very often at that area that is submerged in water, some sliminess can develop. And this is where changing the water daily can be helpful. Okay. So I don't have an answer for you in terms of a shelf life or how much longer you can extend the shelf life. Set up an experiment, take some notes, and see what happens in your particular environments. Okay, thank you. All right, next up from Cherie. What's the proper way to prepare snow peas? Should the strings be removed? Is there a good way to remove them? My approach to these sorts of questions and wonderings that I have from time to time as well is to put the food in my mouth and to go ahead and just chew it up as if I'm the consumer, and see if it's fibrous and tough and stringy. And if so, then it's time to do some trimming or do some prep work in that respect. Sometimes you don't need to remove any strings. Sometimes the product is young, it's tender, and that tough fibrous portion has not developed yet. Okay, and if that's the case, then it's usually easiest to snap off a little bit of the tip and then just pull it along the edge where typically that strand or two of tough fiber develops. Check it out on both sides. I mean, usually it is on the edge that would open up, but sometimes there's a tough fiber that develops on the opposing edge as well. And you might want to remove two edges or just one edge, or sometimes none at all. Okay. And I do it by hand. I just snap off a little bit, or maybe just sometimes it's even a paring knife that I've used. It's just to grab the end of that fibrous thread and then just pull it off. Okay, so those are a couple of techniques for you. Give it a try and see which one is more comfortable for you. All right, keeping in mind that you don't want to cut off too much of the edible portion. You want to maximize your yield, right, of your food. All right, thank you. All right, next up. Sadly, I'm not really computer savvy. With that said, on the breakfast buffet task on the pastry course, it requires us to add a logo to our photo. How is that done? So I see this done in a couple of ways. I see students that will draw up the logo on their computer or cell phone or other device and just have that in the background of the photo. And there are many students that will also print out the Ruby logo, and the size can vary. Then you just put that hard copy somewhere off to the side or in the background of the photo. All right, so those are a couple of ways that will get you to the finish line. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Heather. My cast iron pan has started to bubble on the surface. I season it with salt and oil after heating on stovetop. Is there a risk of the pan corroding? I don't see rust. Wondering if it's safe to use. Yeah, I mean, my quick response is yes, it's probably safe to use. In terms of seasoning, you might try it with just oil, okay, and see if the results vary. And then also, what I see quite often is excessive cleaning after using a cast iron pan. And for example, most of the time I don't even use soap. I just use a relatively soft scrubby, just to get things off that are a little bit stuck, to the pan. But oftentimes soaking the pan in a little bit of water will loosen that up, so you might not have to even put much, effort into it. And because what happens on a cast iron pan is that layer of seasoning is built up and it's worn down. It's built up and it's worn down, and we want to maintain some balance so it doesn't get too worn down. And oftentimes that's due to excessive cleaning, scrubbing, and then sometimes pushing really hard with a metal utensil can also dig into the seasoning layer a little bit. So a couple of things to keep in mind as you're handling that particular cookware. But in terms of addressing the bubbling specifically, if it makes you feel a little more confident here, you might see if you can remove those bubbles, scrape them off, and then just start anew with re-seasoning your pan, and then kind of move forward from there in terms of some careful handling. Okay, thank you. And next up, a question from Karen: any good plant-based sides? My quick answer is yes. There are a bunch of them out there, and as a starting point, take a look at the library of recipes, here at Ruby, to get some ideas. A couple of them that I'll share with you, and thank you very much, Patrick. Patrick just posted links to those recipes. One is the garlic fried quinoa, which is a very simple process. You're cooking quinoa, really your choice, whether it's red or black or white. And you'll finish that by introducing it to a saute pan with some minced garlic to add that flavor. You'll balance your salt as desired, and then garnish it with your favorite herb. I think this recipe might call for parsley, but you can certainly use other fresh herbs as well. So that's going to be a quick side that really goes with just about anything. The other item that I've suggested here is potato salad. And again, depends on what sort of an event and what your audience looks like in terms of the formality of the meal, for example. But a potato salad is very popular, and this one calls for a vegan mayonnaise as the binder. We have another recipe that calls for cashew cream as a binder, and then the internal ingredients are really your typical potato salad sort of aromatics and complementary ingredients, whether it's mirepoix ingredients, maybe the addition of shallots, and then you can take it in different directions in terms of a souring agent, maybe a splash of your favorite vinegar, for example, or a squeeze of lemon or lime juice. Okay, I'll give you another suggestion or another idea. For dinner last night, I have a lot of sweet potatoes and carrots in the kitchen right now. So I did a medium-ish cut dice on those products, and I simmered them with some white soy sauce and some mirin. And mirin is a Japanese seasoning. It's a sweetener and has a little bit of alcohol in it. It's kind of like sweetened sake, but it's a standalone ingredient. And also added some stock to the pan. Gently simmered it just to cook those two items through, the carrots and the sweet potato, while still maintaining their firmness. And I just did a coarse cut on a red chili, and just very lightly, just folded that in at the end so that the whole dish wasn't hot, but you got an occasional little bite of some heat that would balance the sweetness of those main items. And I gave it just a little shake of toasted sesame oil and garnished it with some sesame seeds. And so that was a very quick and easy side dish. You can certainly use any other root vegetable in a similar preparation, and certainly could take the flavors in different directions as well to suit your personal preference or the other items at the table. Okay, thank you. All right, Lorena, good day. I'm about to finish the Pro Plant course. Excellent. It's been an amazing experience. Will I be able to attend your open office hours as a Ruby alumna? You bet. Absolutely. I would welcome you with open arms. And you're certainly welcome to reach out with questions as well. Okay. And I'll give you an early congratulations as you move toward the finish line, and look forward to talking to you again. Thanks. All right, next up. When cooking for a larger group, how much of what you make do you prepare in advance? I understand that things like chopping ingredients can mostly be done in advance, but do you have any other tips for streamlining the process? So this is a great question. This question moves us beyond batch cooking and into other aspects of the logistics, okay, of cooking. And this is really interesting. What I find to be a limiting factor very often is storage space, okay, in particular, refrigerated storage space for those items that, require that cool temperature to maintain either their food safety, right, or just the freshness of the product. Otherwise, if things can be stored at room temperature, or maybe in cool water at room temperature, right, then you can work around some of these storage limitations. Otherwise, within a refrigerator, the space of your refrigerator, try to bring some organization and some space efficiency while using sheet pans. And you can arrange them to be stacked up with using cans as spacers, or some other item that will evenly space them so that they're staying parallel and not touching the food item, of course, underneath. And so these are the sort of things that I think about when it comes to the logistics of food prep. And this comes from my years as a banquet chef and preparing meals for hundreds of guests. You've got to have the logistics that are part of that bigger picture. Many things can be prepared ahead of time, right? As you mentioned, some of the cutting can be done. I try to get all of my garnish work done so that at those last minutes moving up towards service, I'm not scampering around looking for a cutting board and a clean knife. All of that little finishing work is all done. And then, I can very calmly put that final touch on the plate and send it out. Another thing is, if we're cooking items, think about what can be par cooked, right, or par boiled, so that you can cut down on the cooking time, whether it's in an oven, in a saute pan, on a grill, or some other cooking technology that you might be using. Okay, and so this is a great time for us as cooks to start to incorporate some of these techniques, right, that we've covered in the Ruby lessons. For example, the broccoli blanching, parboiling, fully cooking activity. This is when we apply those skills. This is when if we didn't fully understand them before, we will really understand and appreciate them after an experience like you're describing here. Okay. Yes, and so another thing to keep in mind is, as you are designing the menu, right, step one, even before shopping and prepping and cooking, as you're designing the menu, think about incorporating items that can be prepared ahead of time and set out. So it's completely done. It goes out Maybe it's an appetizer or a starter of some sort. It can sit at room temperature. Maybe you place it on ice for some simple temperature preservation. Okay, and then other things that can be assembled and tossed very easily, like a salad. So you have the dressing prepped. You have the greens or other components prepped. You have your garnish prepped. So all you do is you combine those items, and it takes just a few minutes, and then that dish is ready to serve. And then you have other more complicated items that require some cooking, and this is when that the par cooking and par boiling sort of techniques come into play. And so you can mark an item. We say mark an item, meaning put some browning or caramelization on the item, right, as if it's been grilled. And we actually do the marking on a grill or in a saute pan, for example, but then we can finish it on a sheet pan in the oven. And so we can bring the batch cooking efficiency into the picture for finishing. But we use some of these other a la carte techniques around grilling or sauteing just in the beginning to impart visual appeal and also develop flavor through the browning process. Okay, I realize I touched upon a number of different things here, coming at your question from different angles. I hope this makes sense and provides you a starting point for putting together a big meal that will be less stressful for you. All right, thank you. All right, next up from Todd. Why do so many recipes require you to bring to a boil before reducing to a simmer? Why not just start with the simmer? The quick answer here, Todd, is that the time that it takes to get to a simmer and just sort of nail that temperature window can be a while if we're being careful. And oftentimes that's what happens. So in order to speed up the process, we will very often, not always, there's always exceptions, but very often we'll apply some pretty robust heat, and we'll just bring that up to a boil. We know where we are temperature-wise, and then we can just very quickly adjust the heat to maintain a simmer, which is just underneath that boiling point or boiling range. Okay, and so really it's a matter of time efficiency, in my opinion, in my experience. All right, another maybe a secondary aspect of this perhaps is one of food safety, where very often, especially if we're talking about reheating an item like a soup or a stock that then is going to be used for something, we want to bring that up to at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the food code, according to what's considered best practice around heating foods and keeping microorganisms at bay. And if we bring an item up to a boil, we know that we have surpassed that point. Okay. Now, from maybe a more technical standpoint, simmering is also beyond that 165 degree Fahrenheit temperature. But again, we couple that with the efficiency of just bringing it up quickly and getting the job done. Okay. I hope that's helpful for you. Thank you. All right. Next up. Hello, Melissa. I am making creamy leek polenta today. What are some good ways to serve this in a plant-based diet? Any other tips you have about polenta that would be appreciated? I want to start using it more. Some good ways to serve it. I think, you mentioned the word creamy, which tells me that it's probably going to be of a relatively soft consistency. And, another way to vary this is to make it just a little bit stiffer, so that you have some other options on plating. We sometimes work with polenta that is relatively stiff. as it sets up, so that we can cut it into a particular shape, and it can even be sautéed and then put on the plate. So it adds, again, some visual appeal, a different layer of flavor, and then provides for some different presentation or plate design opportunities. All right. And then, otherwise, taste that polenta as it's coming together, with the leek and, whatever else you have going in there. And then start experimenting with additional flavor facets, right? Or flavorings to either bring in complexity to the finished product or to steer the flavor in one regional sort of flavor profile or another. And you can really have some fun with what otherwise seems like a pretty simple item, right? I mean, the polenta, after all, is kind of a canvas, right, of sorts. So it gives you a lot of leeway to play around with flavor and presentation styles. In terms of what you might serve it with, I think as as that sort of starchy item goes, that grain item goes on the plate, it really goes with anything. And you have the opportunity to serve it piping hot or at a slightly cooler temperature if that might complement one item or another. Okay. And so those are a couple of things to keep in mind. Yeah, I think that answers your two-part question here. All right, thank you. Okay, next up, are Ruby instructors willing to look at photos of dishes, plating, etc., that are not part of any graded assignment and provide feedback? Marina, I really appreciate your question here and your interest, right, in tapping into our experience, our collective experience here. But, I will politely decline because we have our plates full, so to speak. We have just a lot of activities coming in from the many students out there. And we would like to maintain our focus on those graded assignments to give you the most fitting feedback. Okay, I appreciate your understanding. Thank you. All right, and next up from Carol Ann. I make my own almond milk for my AM coffee and some baking. All right, replacing dairy. I use the leftover pulp also in baking for savory crackers or cookies, for thickening veggie soups, and I still have tons left over. How long will the pulp keep? Like a lot of food items, this will freeze. And if you do freeze it, I always recommend labeling and dating items because, at least in my experience, I have the confidence up front to certainly remember what it is that I'm putting in my freezer. The freezer is not that big after all, but the uncanny ability to forget what I put into the freezer, only to find these unlabeled items weeks or perhaps months later. I'm not sure. So do start out, by labeling your products. I always recommend also containers or units in sizes that will be appropriate to what you think you might use it for in the future, so that you, for example, don't have to defrost a large quantity only to use a smaller portion of that, because that will shorten the shelf life of the remainder of the product. Okay, and then also to use the product rather than keeping it in the freezer for too long. Keep in mind that, generally speaking, items continue to decline in quality in the freezer. And so I always recommend using things sooner than later. Try to get back to it in just a few weeks rather than a few months, for example, or even a few days rather than a few weeks, if that fits into your cooking rotation. Okay. Thank you very much. And next up. Hello, Stephen. I recently became a private chef for a family after 24 years in country clubs. I would like to know if had any advice, online courses, books, or websites you can suggest to sharpen my skills with service and healthy recipes? Wow. Okay. So this is a fun question. It's also a big and broad question. I mean, in terms of books and websites, I mean, nothing rolls off my tongue here. Perhaps given some time, I might rustle up some ideas. I mean, in terms of other suggestions, if, for example, you are interested in a plant-based focus, I would recommend one of our courses. And, for somebody with your professional kitchen experience, I mean, I would immediately direct you to our Pro Plant course, which is our 6-month course. It's one of our long ones, one of our pro courses. And, I think the level of expectation in that class, as well as the variety of skills and information, would push you very nicely down what might be a new path for you. I'm not sure. It certainly was a fantastic course for me after many years in a conventional professional kitchen, cooking all kinds of things, to take a plant-based focus. I found it challenging. I found it rewarding. And, that would be certainly a recommendation. Okay. If you have more specific questions, that we might dialogue on, feel free to reach out to me at support@rouxbe.com. Thank you. All right, Kathy, hello. Regarding storing lettuce and greens, I have been successful in using the veggie bags for storing large greens. I wash and spin dry lettuces, wrap them in a kitchen cotton towel, and store them in a plastic bag in the refrigerator. Perfect. Thank you so much for this suggestion. And this will definitely inform the earlier question, right, on storing leafy green items. And I appreciate this specific idea. Thanks. All right, next up from Tamiko. What is the difference between the Culinary Rx course and the Forks Over Knives course? It looks like most of the lessons are the same. There is certainly some overlap between the two. I will begin by saying that the FOK, the Forks Over Knives course, is quite a bit longer and more in-depth. That is, I'm going to say it's approaching twice as long. Not exactly, but it's approaching twice as long as Culinary Rx. I'll give you a little bit of background, okay, putting these courses into some context. The Culinary Rx course was designed for physicians to prescribe to their patients that would benefit from more cooking rather, on their own, scratch cooking, rather than eating processed foods and refined foods. And, while the Culinary Rx course isn't exclusively or necessarily 100% plant-based, it pretty much is. The Culinary Rx course, again, as far as that original intent, would also allow that physician or other medical professional to address any chronic health conditions in a package, in a Culinary Rx package that was relatively short and one that a person relatively new to cooking, could find success in. The Forks Over Knives course is a little bit more in depth, as I mentioned, and provides much more information on cooking techniques and supporting information around making a transition specifically to a plant-based diet. Okay. The Forks Over Knives course also, certainly appeals to folks that want to start cooking more from scratch, as well as address any chronic concerns, whether it's overweight or obesity, type 2 diabetes, or other common concerns that that people experience these days. Okay, and so that's just in a nutshell how those two stack up against each other. Thank you. Oh, yeah, I'll also mention that the Forks Over Knives course, this is probably the important part, has a lot more instructor-graded assignments. And so you would have more interaction with the instructors as well. Thanks. All right, Lorena's back. Being well-seasoned chef. Okay, pun intended. I like that. Would you be able to differentiate the usage of garlic powder versus garlic cloves in a recipe? Thinking of how to increase the efficiency of my business process. Yeah, what I find as probably the number one difference is that when using fresh garlic, I'm getting sharper, more pronounced garlic flavor tones. And certainly that depends on the variety of garlic that you're using, because there are many to choose from. Some are very mild, but most of the garlic that's available in mainstream markets, and I see a couple of varieties, but they tend to have some pretty distinctive or even sharp aroma and sometimes even heat or a bite, right, that we associate with garlic. And versus garlic powder, which tends to be more uniform in flavor. I think part of this would also depend upon the application. So, for example, if you're putting together an item that is dry, then starting with a dry ingredient like garlic powder or granulated garlic, it could be another option. Has its efficiencies, right? You don't have to go through a drying process to make it shelf stable. Another consideration is that consistency, right? A fresh product like garlic cloves will often have some variation, right, between heads of garlic and sometimes even between the cloves themselves. So it's going to take two things in that situation. Your skill to balance those differences to the extent that that's necessary, but also it takes an audience or a consumer that is able to enjoy those variations in that finished dish. So in other words, they appreciate the skill that you bring to the cooking as a professional. Now, on the other hand, if you have let's say it's a packaged food item, or maybe a certain audience that wants more consistency, right, in that finished product. And this is where a dried product, a processed product like garlic powder can provide that necessary consistency in the end or finished product. Okay, so those are a couple of things that I would definitely consider. Cost is something that many of us consider, the food cost on that particular ingredient. And that's going to be a quick comparison, right, to look at how these items stack up on a unit-to-unit basis. So on a kilo to kilo basis or a tablespoon to tablespoon basis, depending on how you use that. All right. I hope that helps. That helps you. Thank you. All right. Next up, what's a good way to reheat vegetables that have been exposed to an ice bath after taking such care with them? Zapping them in a microwave doesn't seem right. Yes, great question, Todd. So I think what we're talking about here is a par cooking or a par boiling scenario where we then shock the product with the intent of a secondary finishing step, right, to heat it for service. So, in that case, I think that you can use really any cooking method that is desirable, right, or that's suitable for the end product. And, so in other words, those chilled items could be heated up in a saute pan, on a grill, in the oven, or in the microwave, right? Again, whatever logistically makes sense for you, okay? And so, give that a try. Generally speaking, again, I think it really depends on the item and probably some other details here. But as a starting point, keep in mind that the item has been partially cooked, and you get to control the extent of the cooking, right? Are you cooking it 80% through, or are you cooking it 50% through? So that remaining 20% or remaining 50% to be cooked is a big difference. And so you'll need to adjust the heat of your fire in that last stage of cooking accordingly. So if you have, a smaller window of cooking to work with, then work with a higher heat and a shorter cooking time. Again, some experimentation is probably going to be required on your part to find the balance that suits your situation. All right, thank you. All right, look who's back. Lorena. I am at the raw cuisine unit. A Ruby recipe suggests to be served with cooked grains. You've had to use a heat method for those grains, right? In most cases, yes. I would certainly recommend cooking grains if that's the case. We have some exceptions out there where you can certainly eat grains that haven't been cooked after simply soaking. They are edible, harder to digest, and the enjoyment level varies. Okay, if to continue here, if water boils at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and raw cuisine won't use heat, 118 degrees, then the final dish should not be considered strictly raw, right? Correct. That would technically be correct. I'm confused because the cooking task is coming next. So by suggesting this stir raw with ginger miso sauce with cooked grains, it's a combination of cooking methods. Okay. Lorena, could you please email me that particular task number or recipe link, and I'll take a look at that. And then, we can further dialogue on this. And if necessary, I could make some edits to make that make sense. Okay. But let's approach it that way. All right. Thank you. All right. Next up from Kirk. I am a CEC, CCA, and CPC. I'm trying to get the ACF to create a certification for plant-based chefs. CPBC, can I email you to get some ideas on how to garner support from those of you that might be interested in seeing this happen? I'm a student. Yes, Kirk, I certainly recognize you as a student, and I'm so glad you can join us today. Yeah, do reach out to me. Okay, so give me a shout at support@ruby.com. Your message will make its way to me, and then I will, enlist other colleagues as needed, into this discussion here. I think it's a very interesting one and a timely one as well. Thank you very much. All right. Looks like a follow-up perhaps from Cherie. You mentioned both garlic powder and garlic granules. How do they differ, and when would you use one over the other? Thank you. Basically, they differ in their size, right? Where powder is a finer texture, and granules is going to be a larger or coarser item. Okay. When we use one over the other, there's definitely overlap. First of all, consider granules where you might want to see some of the product, in the finished dish. Some of the product means some of the granules. Also, there's going to be a surface area difference, right? Where the finer powder has greater surface area, therefore, usually a greater garlicky flavor that's imparted to the food. And so those are a couple of considerations that come to mind immediately. Okay, but give them a try. You can certainly use them, at your discretion and interchangeably if you want to. All right. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's office hours. I want to thank all of you for joining me today. And I wish you all a great week ahead and lots of cooking. And, until we meet next time, enjoy. Thank you.